Hey, Gary, excited to sit down with you today. I know that you have done several reports on malicious telecom infrastructure, and you are out here with another banger. So, for the folks who maybe haven't had a chance to read the report, sort of what's the main takeaway from it that you want people to know?
Sure. I think most people, Monica, when they take a sort of a high level picture of telecom infrastructure, they don't really understand that threats exist aside from some of the sort of major media breaches, like that occurred from, say, China.
Mm.
And what I want people to take away from the Citizen Lab research is that these threats happen constantly. Um, and for the most part, they're private. So, the important takeaway is that, threats are constantly happening. There are intrusions into telecom infrastructure, and revealing this is really intended to open people's eyes, to kind of reflect on what is actually happening, in terms of the threat landscape.
So why now? I mean, you've said this has been happening. Why is now the moment that folks need to be paying attention?
Yeah, it's years ago, there were often theoretical, arguments about the vulnerabilities associated with SS7 telecom infrastructure. So what I wanted to do in terms of from a research perspective is take a look at more sophisticated threats and identifying sophisticated threats, from advanced actors that are engaged, in espionage and surveillance activity really takes a long time to surface. The infrastructure itself is intended to be private, despite the threat actors accessing the infrastructure. So it took a while to obtain the evidence that can definitively point to commercial threat actors that are engaged in long-running espionage operations within the telecom infrastructure.
So can you walk us through that evidence? How does this actually work at a technical level? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so starting in order to detect this activity, you need a mechanism to actually collect data. And data collection, in the private signaling landscape, which is where these particular attacks took place, requires really a partnership, with third parties, that are on the inside that have the capability of identifying threats or suspected threats, and B, really uh, having the ability to collect what you need, in order for you to observe and analyze, that evidence. Um, and to be honest with you, Monica, the evidence, really requires a discipline as well. As any researcher would say, discipline and patience and persistence, is always the key. So, it is it's difficult, to really make sense of this data. It's a completely different set of protocols, a completely different language, and a completely different sort of mindset in order to, detect these threats that are really coming from, common sources. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, I mean, for somebody like me who's not steeped in the weeds like you are, it feels like telecom carriers and infrastructure providers should be able to like have more visibility into this or at least be able to step in some way. So, why is this so dependent on third parties to go in and mitigate or even research?
Yeah, the operators, are not security experts. And in the way operators sort of structure their business is very operationally focused, not security focused. And
Mm,
that's their business, right? They launch products, they provide connectivity, and they make sure it works. So there's a really a very specific and specialized discipline, and that discipline is generally provided by those that provide firewall services or a combination of firewall and threat intelligence services. And even then, I mean, their job is to block threats, not to analyze them. So, independent researchers and those that are engaged on the threat intelligence side are really the ones that can point out, these more sophisticated attacks and understand the techniques, the procedures, the methods that are being used, and these are constantly evolving and getting more and more sophisticated. So it's definitely a challenging environment, but it's important to really be transparent, and ensure that users know that they're not always safe, with just a virus protection, agent on their device. It helps, but when you take a look at network, it's a completely different threat landscape.
Well, thank goodness you're here. So when we're actually digging into this, what are the actors doing? What did you see? What might an end user see on their device?
Yeah, I mean, this is where things really become very difficult, from an end user perspective, and really where I think the industry needs to change a bit. A lot of the state, of your mobile device, when you connect to the network, is being held in the network, and not on the device, right? So these particular actors were engaged in, location tracking activity, which is one of the big, one of the major objectives, of these threat actors. There is communications interception, denial of service. There's some other attack types, but by and large, from a very malicious, perspective, the network constantly, maintains, state of your device. And so if you're on the inside, which these threat actors were, it becomes easier for them. I'm not going to say anything is easy, but they're already on the inside. And so it really becomes a battle between the surveillance actor and the firewall provider, that's designed to prevent this type of activity. So they were engaged in location tracking activity. They used multiple networks to access, the private signaling infrastructure, mobile signaling infrastructure. And they used different techniques, in that they, borrowed these addresses, which are called signaling addresses, both in 4G and 5G, 4G and 3G, that is SS7 and diameter protocols. And they use those techniques to try to circumvent or get around and penetrate the firewalls. And this is not, uncommon activity. It's constant battle. And this is, all targeting a single individual, and it's in a very sort of very tight time frame, which is what you commonly see. You don't see, attempts over days or weeks generally. These are very tight windows. And it becomes clear what the objective is they want to find out what a user is doing right now and where they're at.
Speaking of sort of operating inside, I think that's something, that we talk about a lot at iVerify. Modern attacks are operating inside trusted processes. Is that sort of, what the research confirms here?
It does, to a large extent. A lot of, especially paranoid security users like you and I,
Sure
we're
am.
constantly concerned about it, right? And you hope and pray that the operators, are protecting your identity, and they have infrastructure in place and processes in place to prevent, attacks. But around the world, it's not like that. In other words, there are very, repressive geographic locations. State actors, which are, the primary, actors that are involved in these types of espionage operations, and the commercial entities that are the specialists that provide the surveillance infrastructure that they sell. Um, so, I would say that, yes, it's intended to be private, but like anything else, anything can be defeated, right? If given the amount of persistence and access, that is granted. Once you provide access, all bets are off.
I hear a lot from security leaders that they feel like, they're sort of check the box on mobile. They have it covered with, their MDM or MTD solutions. Is that something that would have come into play here? Like, would those solutions have been able to see that this activity was happening or even thwart it?
Yeah, excellent question, and one that is probably to a large degree is a misconception. Uh, that there's a belief that everything touches the device, and as mentioned earlier, you know there are some types of location tracking that actually hits the device, but there are limitations with MTD solutions where they may not touch the baseband, right, which is the where that communication takes place.
Mm,
Some device platforms have more capabilities than others to do that. But what it really comes down to really is a combination of network level visibility and device level visibility. And another finding is that commercial surveillance actors often operate in both spaces. In other words, the most effective type of surveillance is one where you can defeat you know you can defeat a firewall, or B, an MTD solution. Um, and if you're operating in both spaces, then you increase your likelihood of success.
hmm.
So, I think that, there's a lot of work to be done, in terms of actor attribution and, identification of infrastructure where these threat actors operate. This is a work in progress, but we've actually made a lot of headway, in terms of finding, common entry points, where actors get in on the inside. And also the source networks, right, where a lot of these attacks take place. So if you look at the threat landscape and you see the networks and the countries, where these actors are primarily operating in, you get a pretty good idea of, your sort of high risk, locations, in terms of traveling, or even, remote, employees or staff that are stationed that, if they are compromised, then it could result in, a much more serious and significant, risk to an organization.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will be surprised to see sort of the geographic spread of this research. I think one of the big misconceptions that I hear a lot, and maybe you do too, is that, unless an executive is traveling to China, there's no real risk here. So, just looking at the report, are you seeing that, we're seeing broad targeting of employees, or is this still really focused to, a CEO or C-suite executive?
A little bit, depending on the actor involved. When I say actor, really, there's two pieces, right? There's the surveillance, infrastructure from a commercial side. Could be a hosted infrastructure that's sold to, nation states for the purposes of engaging, in espionage activity. And so, if you look at the objectives, of a lot of the, end customer that is using the surveillance platform, I think you will find that it is a common individual that might work for a security company. It could be a State Department, working employee working out of an embassy, and it could be, a critical infrastructure, where you have a CEO or other type of executive. Or, in many cases, it could be, specific groups, of people that become targets, as sort of high risk individuals, that are located in highly repressive um, um, countries. So these are the, like activists or someone that poses a threat, to a highly repressive nation, nation or country.
And I mean, we don't have to travel very far, right? We had the massive revelations around Salt Typhoon at home. I think that hopefully reframed, the telecom security conversation and mobile security conversation for a lot of executives.
Yeah.
So, how would you connect the dots between this report and what we're seeing in terms of state-sponsored telecom targeting, at home for enterprise defenders?
Yeah, so as it pertains to state level targeting at home, I did some research years and years ago, and what I found is that really there's two elements that I find particularly interesting to bring up. One is um, information harvesting. It's almost like info stealing, very broadly, but from a state level point of view, they want to collect, massive amounts of information on individuals. And I'm trying not to, put my hat on, where I sound like a somebody who has has an issue, with sort of nation states broadly, but more, of what is the overall sort of risk? And it remains to be seen, I would say, from a large enterprises. What I would say is that, there are pockets of industries, which are particularly sensitive that nation state actors, constantly want to target. And so kind of looking from a traditional spyware, surveillanceware perspective, there is targeting of, specific, defense industries, financial institutions
Hmm.
are constantly targeted too, even by nation states, certainly by criminal, actors. Those do operate, in the telecom infrastructure. So there's like a lot of interception of messaging or multi-factor authentication codes and things like that that are still sent over SMS, right? Despite the constant, warnings, about don't do this, people still do it. And actors know this too, on the commercial side. Telecom is a great spot for them to intercept, these authentication codes. And so that is still seen, to this day, to a lower degree because, the access needed can sometimes be difficult to get and very expensive. And that's why, the very large sort of advanced sophisticated commercial surveillance vendors operate in this space and nation states buy it. But, I would say, there are pockets of industries where, enterprises should be particularly concerned, I would say, and really take a look at, threat risk, as it pertains to travel, as it pertains to, even at home, there's some degree of risk as well. People think that the U.S. is well protected, but we saw from Salt Typhoon that that's not the case. So I think everybody needs to be on guard and also consume, the threat intelligence data that exists, and for example, iVerify is really kind of looking into this space, and I'm leading the charge on that effort. And to the extent that you can get more and more intelligence on where, these threats take place, the type of threats, you can get a better idea of where you need to be, particularly on guard in specific geographic locations, or even things like using different SIMs, when you travel, for example. It's a basic protection, but it's one that can be effective. There are other types of services that you can use that might be provide an extra layer of protection as well. But I think it all starts with threat intelligence and threat visibility. It starts there. Once you have that knowledge, then you understand, where your particular organization could be at risk.
It does really feel like the mobile security conversation is being framed around telecom risk, even if we see um, the moves made by FCC to fully fund, rip and replace efforts where Huawei and ZTE, hardware exists in rural networks, and some of the bans that we've seen on, TP-Link routers and other foreign-made devices. How would you frame this actually for a CISO when you're looking, at the broader telecom mobile security problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that, supply chain risk is real. An example of that, in the network space, the sort of critical infrastructure, telecom infrastructure space, uh, infrastructure needs to be supported, and traditionally, these are supported by third parties, vendors, right? And vendors have access to equipment for the purposes of supporting that, right? And improving the operations. So as supply chain, equipment, in telecom infrastructure and that are acquired, by operators, it is a real risk. So you've got the commercial surveillance actors that are offering surveillance services, and then you have the surveillance the vendors, of equipment, that can present a very valid, supply chain risk. So, again, gaining visibility into, supply chain, geographically speaking, and different operators provides, another layer of insight, to an organization. For example, if I have staff that are located, at an office overseas, and these people need to buy cell phone services from an operator. Well, which operator should they choose? Should they choose the one that has a bunch of Huawei ZTE equipment that are known to present a viable supply chain risk? Or, should they select, an operator that, provides, that uses, infrastructure vendor that, is might be considered more safe. I'm not going to say that everything is safe, but right, it's all about risk mitigation, I think from a supply chain perspective. So, I think that is another sort of critical piece of threat intelligence, that should be incorporated into the overall, decision-making process from an organization.
Feels like one of the core themes here is around, visibility. What are some of those, non-negotiables for you in terms of effective detection for mobile threats?
Yeah, it really comes down to identifying and sort of filtering out what is malicious versus non-malicious activity. And, the data sets, that, we're using right now, for the threat intelligence offering, uh, can provide, identification of different types of threats. These are different classifications. So, for example, the location tracking example that we talked about a little bit earlier, and that we was the focus of the Citizen Lab report. Communications interception, denial of service. if you take a look at, the aggregate, of where these threats exist, you get a better understanding of, the type of activity from a geographic perspective, and even overlaying things like geopolitical risks as well. So you really need to kind of examine the type of threats, the operators, and the country. So you're really taking a look at the sources, and the sources really provide a lot of insight, um, from a risk level perspective. Adding in the supply chain to the equation, I think provides a greater level, of understanding as well. And then, calculating that, really into a risk score that can be interpreted. You know, uh, Enterprises, organizations aren't telecom professionals, right? So they don't, understand the bits and bytes of telecom signaling or these types of surveillance attacks. But, understanding the types of, attacks that take place, where they take place, and then being able to sort of lay that out on a risk scoring basis, can provide, an easier, level of understanding for people that, might not have a or might not care, right, about understanding, telecom networks or telecom surveillance.
Does the research at all change the calculus on, BYOD versus managed devices for enterprises, particularly for high risk individuals?
Yeah, it doesn't really, from a device platform perspective, it doesn't. It's common, since a lot of these attacks take place at the network level.
Hmm.
There is nothing that really can be exposed on the device. I think, the kind of going back into the multi-vector, nature of surveillance, right? Where there could be, device level threats and network level threats is really kind of an important component in that. There could be, some risk, for example, on the device side, from the same commercial actor that might be targeting the network side too. So an example of that would be, a managed device, that's part of an overall sort of corporate security mandate, uh, uh, and looking at somebody that is bringing a device that doesn't provide any level of protection naturally presents a greater risk, because attacks might be blocked on the network side, right? And the same, threat actor might also target the device, in which case the BYOD device would present, a greater set of vulnerabilities naturally. Um, but when you take a look at kind of the overall picture, and on the network side, it really doesn't change the calculus, at all, because a lot of these attacks are region specific, network specific, and if a particular network is vulnerable and gets attacked, then there's nothing really a user can do about it, and they have no idea it's taking place.
So you've got some street cred, if you've worked some places, you're definitely on some radars. So let's say that you're traveling to a high risk area. Like, what are you doing? What would you have a CISO do to set someone up for a success who might be traveling to a known risky area?
Well, I think, starting out, threatened intelligence, individuals at an organization, a user should be, communicating, with the threat team, right? And what you there's a couple of reasons for that, as they may be traveling into, an area that represents a personal risk, that they should be aware of, and B, the threat intelligence folks at that particular organization should also understand where the risks take place. So, B is, kind of really understanding, well, what is the level of risk for traveling to a particular location, from a surveillance perspective. And then B is, offering, a level of protections, maybe a heightened level of sensitivity, like is your device operating strangely? Um, and what I mean by that is that, there are specific, orchestrated attacks that can influence how the device behaves on the network. For example, there are a certain orchestration where a sophisticated threat actor, not to dig into the weeds too far, but they could knock the device off the network because that threat actor knows the IMSI, which is the network identity of the device. And in this case, a communication would be missed, right, for some period of time because now the threat actor has control of the device's, network state,
Hmm.
your phone's network state. So you should be conscious of, sort of a peculiar, or unusual, device activity. I'm constantly, aware of how my device operates when I'm traveling. And in some cases, if you're engaged in some, particularly sensitive um, discussions or meetings or locations, it might make sense to flip off the device, every now and then, um, which could keep the threat actor guessing, right? That could work. It could not work in your favor. For location tracking, it might be a good idea, but for interception, communications interception, it might enable the attacker to intercept communications because now, if they know what your device IMSI is, they could be on the network, right? And get your communications. It's a really difficult thing. One thing that I do is actually acquire different, multiple services from different providers, and using eSIM, you can have, multiple services on your device. And it might be a good idea to change, your IMSI, your phone number. I mean, you can still have access to the same services, right? It may impact them slightly, but in some cases, it's better to be safe than sorry. So there are, certain types of mitigations that take place, but I think, that threat visibility and looking at, threat amplification, in with current data sets, right? Current threat intelligence data sets, so that you know what is happening, at any given point of time as quickly as you can, as soon as you can, really provides you with, some key insights that you can do some level of threat mitigation, at the device level, or maybe, cranking down, right, device level security in particular regions too, is always a good idea.
It really does feel like mobile is the moment here, and it's surprising that there's so few deep dive researchers like yourself that are looking into this and doing the research. And like you mentioned earlier, these take significant time to develop and investigate and be able to make heads or tails of. What does that lag mean then for defenders? Like, are we sort of even behind on understanding the ways that threat actors are manipulating, infrastructure for their advantages? Do you think that this is an accurate current snapshot?
My hope is that, with this type of research that, did take, a long time, admittedly, much longer than I would have liked. But, getting this information out, I think really is a wake-up call to people. And that wake-up call could, encourage um, mobile operators really to kind of understand the threats and maybe, improve how they lock down the network. It can, benefit firewall providers and even facilitate, partnerships, which is always a good thing. We have partnerships, security companies have partnerships all the time. I think those partnerships also need to take place, on the network side. Uh, and by doing so, it really benefits the end users, which are the pay the bills, right? They pay the bills for the mobile operators, uh, and they also, give threat intelligence teams the capabilities that they need to better protect, their organizations and the users, behind them. So I think that partnership, is really kind of a critical aspect. I'm hoping, will come out of this report, right, and get folks talking and really try to help the overall um, security industry, right, and the level of security they can ultimately provide end users.
Can you give us a little bit of sort of background about maybe where things started and actually how much progress we've made?
Yeah, I mean, I have been in the industry a long time, and it was the Wild West, and I think still you can still think of this as a bit of the Wild West, right? Just because of the observations, of the amount of activity. Back in the 2018, 2019 time frame, when the GSMA was kind of started to focus on the security and protecting networks. There was always a sort of this consciousness of protecting networks, but didn't really know how real the threats were, right? And it's not until you provide the tools and put tools in place and begin to look at the threat activity when it's just this eye-opening moment. And that was, for me, that was really a holy bleep, moment, right? Which is it is so bad, right? Things are so bad out there. We need to protect these networks immediately. And really that drove kind of the growth of the firewalls, really putting, signaling network firewalls in place and really kind of build that security consciousness, in the minds, of operators and of intercarrier providers, the wholesale providers that provide the connectivity. And it really sort of started out at, providing basic level protections. But the threat actors are always, ahead of the always ahead of the security vendors. I like to think that we're catching up quickly, but there is, it is critical infrastructure at the end of the day, and it takes time, right, to build a robust security framework in place, at telecom networks. And we've definitely made a lot of strides. There's been a lot of strides, but the vulnerabilities and protocols still exist, right? So, and clearly, threat actors are gaining access. They're on the inside now. And firewalls are basically protect certain layers of the network, from 3G to 4G to the data side, and in SMS as well, to prevent, like gray route, smishing attacks, and things like that, that you can put, robust um, on-device security frameworks like SmishGuard in place. And these protections are definitely improving, but there are still high levels of vulnerability. So I don't want to belabor that aspect, but it has been an interesting sort of ride to where we're coming into place now. And I think telecoms security providers are really more open to information sharing, which is really critical. So I think we've come a long way, but I think we still have a long ways to go.
I won't retire my tinfoil hat quite yet then.
Don't do it. Keep it.
There's one thing I know about group projects. It's that one person usually does 90% of the work. So if you have one sort of takeaway for CISOs, as we're hoping for collaboration between many different partners behind the scenes to, improve overall telecom security, what are, CISOs able to do that's in their control to make their fleet more secure right now?
Well, I think CISOs need to kind of leverage, expertise that exists, at security companies, right? They are focused constantly, on just that, right? On protection. And it can be overwhelming, for CISOs, right, to think about all these sort of different moving parts and leveraging the expertise, of folks, of companies, of iVerify that is constantly looking, at this stuff, is constantly engaged in research, constantly, working on attribution, providing, forensic indicators that can really kind of improve, the protection capabilities, of their teams that are in many cases thinly staffed, right? Or may lack the level of expertise that specific security companies have. I think it's that they should be leveraging as much as they can, experts in the field.
Amazing. Thanks so much for your time, Gary.
Thanks, Monica.